Chapter 4. The Myth's Modern Purveyors, reviewing Selig and Nielsen. Abstract. Whatever its origins, the myth of black buying power today has really only two sources: the Selig Center for Economic Growth and Nielsen Consumer Surveys. The two are complicit in promoting the myth, but more as silent partners to commercial press, media, and punditry. Selig and Nielsen are clear not to attach claims of black political or economic power to the myth, but they do provide intellectual cover to those who do, and they are both involved in the myth's overall promotion. And because their express goal is to connect media with ad revenue and not to clarify any actual economic conditions, Selig and Nielsen are able to develop unclear methods which produce results inconsistent with economic analyses used to assess the actual material and lived experiences of black and other communities. Keywords: Nielsen, Selig Center, advertising, journalism. What appears to be the initial report from the Selig Center for Economic Growth at the Terry College of Business, housed in the Bank of America Financial Center in Athens, Georgia, in 1994, marks a moment in history when an esoteric marketing concept, kept mostly among those for whom buying power actually means anything, went viral. That is, viral for the 1990s. Though suffering the limitations of 20th century media technology, buying power did begin to take on a new life. For the next 25 years, and counting, Jeffrey Humphreys, the lead author and the Selig Center, would become the single most referenced source on the subject. And as will be detailed below, the center is referenced routinely. What apparently does not occur is any critical investigation into the claims contained in those reports, or those from its primary partner in myth propagation, the Nielsen Company. In each case, methods used to determine or extrapolate consumer spending habits are confused by subsequent reporting and, it must be said, not enough effort to be clear by those tasked in representing those reports into a belief that the numbers shared represent an economic strength which simply does not exist. The Selig Center produces buying power reports to assist businesses target their advertising purchases. Nielsen works with the black press to produce similar reports to assist the black press justify its own claims that more ad revenue be spent among black media to help bring those black consumers to white corporations. The uncritical, unchecked promotion and circulation of the myth encourages a punditry and even activist acceptance and appropriation of the myth for their own purposes, allowing for even those who make routine criticism of capitalism and white supremacy to mistakenly infuse a false concept of buying power into their analyses. For example, a recent Nielsen report titled, quote, "Resilient, Receptive, and Relevant, the African American Consumer Report," end quote, co-authored with the National Newspapers Publishers Association, NNPA, the leading association of black newspaper publishers in the country, states clearly that the two have strategically collaborated for 3 years to present an annual in-depth analytical report of the African American consumer, unsurpassed by any other similar product on the market. The reports have become widely respected. Industry chronicles touted for their exclusive insights, data, trends, and perspective that better prepare marketers and brands to connect with this audience segment. By concurrently sharing the report with millions of readers around the country, we have also helped create conscious consumers who are aware, now more than ever, how their economic power has a direct impact on the marketplace overall. We are proud that the combined Nielsen and NNPA resources have galvanized corporations and consumers alike to think and behave differently toward valuing the African American consumer and their economic impact on the U.S. marketplace. Nielsen, 2013, emphasis added. Interestingly, while this and reports like it make reference to numbers produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they do so only as a source for black unemployment rates. This is noteworthy, given that the BLS origins of the concept, as described previously, had a very different purpose. Here, because, as the report acknowledges, it is to help corporations and, quote, brands, end quote, reach their targeted black market. The concept of buying power becomes something else, mythological. Parenthetically, it is interesting to read the admission in the report that it has as its mission that corporations and consumers be, quote, galvanized, end quote. It was, in fact, Edward Bernays who defined propaganda, public relations, psychological warfare, marketing, advertising, as the creation of a, quote, reciprocal understanding between an individual and a group, end quote. Miller, 2005, 161. Put differently, the, quote, reciprocal understanding, end quote, is that the target audience come to agree with the generated message. In this case, that message is an acceptance by the black consumer of the marketing and the transfer of what is available for them to spend with white corporations. Of course, further and most damaging is the acceptance of this process as exemplifying some kind of genuine black power. It should also be noted that the economic picture painted of black America in this report, like most of its kind, does not reflect the actual conditions previously described. Its goal, following the trend given Elevated Life in 1954 by John H. Johnson, is to promote to white advertisers that despite historic inequality, the black consumer is, quote, resilient, end quote, and always able to come back ready to spend. Data are poorly interpreted to justify the claims and to reframe reality in such a way as to not dissuade ad revenue from flowing toward black presses and punditry, which enjoy those dollars most. Were this left to the marketing community alone, that would be one issue. But, as the report proudly acknowledges, with the propulsion of the black press itself, distorted claims regarding black economic conditions are encouraged as reality by members of the community and promoted to the community as fact. For example, without evidence or vetting, the report simply repeats and attributes to it the Selig Center claim of black buying power, quote, rising from its current $1 trillion level to a forecasted $1.3 trillion by 2017, end quote. Nielsen, 2013, 4. Supporting the claim are references to, quote, impressive gains, end quote, made by black women in education and business ownership, black consumers being loyal to name brands and beauty supplies, how social media, quote, continue to engage, end quote, black consumers of all ages, and that not enough ad dollars are spent on television targeting black audiences who, by percentage of population, watch more than anyone in the country. Perhaps most disturbing, however, is the call from among black media and journalists, specifically, for a, quote, Southern strategy, end quote, to target marketing toward the numbers of black people moving back south in a, quote, reverse migration, end quote. This use of the phrase, quote, Southern strategy, end quote, with quotations around the phrase, as if to acknowledge the fact, disturbingly harkens back to the intentionally racist media strategy of the Republican Party. First with Barry Goldwater, then Richard Nixon, and on to Ronald Reagan, a campaign which targeted the anti black, white supremacist attitudes of white Southerners to attract their votes. Maxwell, 2019, making that phrase an even more interesting choice for use in marketing material, attempting to connect black consumers to white companies. In 2018, I asked reporter Ellie Yu about her national public radio marketplace story and its reference to both Nielsen and Selig in claiming that, quote, black women own about 1.5 million businesses in the country, according to the latest U.S. Census figures, generating more than $42 billion in sales in 2012, end quote. U 2018. I asked if she could share, beyond reference, just to the reports themselves, where those numbers came from. Indicative of the journalistic process, which helps propel the myth of buying power, she responded in part that, quote, the Selig Center study, unfortunately, is only available by purchase. I referenced their statistics that they were available in their public press release and confirmed it with Jeff Humphreys of the Selig Center who worked on the report, end quote. My email to Humphreys went without response. Even more heavily resourced national media simply make headlines of a press release with confirmation from its author and with no review or investigation of the claims, methods, or inherent and expressed bias as representing the interests of the business community. For lay readers, a $125 fee for the Selig report is an obvious barrier, though it could be argued no such concern should exist for national media who make routine reporting out of the center's work, particularly when their expressed mission is, quote, to raise the economic intelligence of the country, end quote. Marketplace. However, once the barrier of cost and of an incurious press is overcome, there remain barriers of methodology, accuracy, context, and clarity. On one hand, as mentioned, the Selig report is indeed straightforward in defining buying power as a concept and explaining its actual function. According to the latest available report titled The Multicultural Economy, 2017, simply defined, buying power is the total personal income of residents that is available, after taxes, for spending on virtually everything that they buy, but it does not include dollars that are borrowed or that were saved in previous years. It is not a measure of wealth, and it does not include what tourists spend during their visits. Unfortunately, there are no geographically precise surveys of annual expenditures and income of all the nation's major racial and ethnic groups. Even estimates of expenditures by race or ethnicity are difficult to find, especially for individual states. Emphasis added. The Selig Center addresses this problem by providing estimates of Black, Native American, Asian, white, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic buying power for the nation, the 50 states, and the District of Columbia. These current dollar, unadjusted for inflation, estimates and projections indicate the growing economic power of various racial or ethnic groups, measure the vitality of geographic markets, help to judge business opportunities for startups or expansions, gauge a business's annual sales growth against potential market increases, indicate the market potential of new and existing products, and guide targeted advertising campaigns. Humphreys, 2017. As previously highlighted, Seelig acknowledges that it was, quote, created to convey economic expertise to Georgia businesses and entrepreneurs. The Simon S. Seelig Jr. Center for Economic Growth is primarily responsible for conducting research on economic, demographic, and social issues related to Georgia's current and future growth. End quote. With that as its mission, and not the production of research whose purpose is the accurate assessment of any actual economic condition, it follows reasonably that the report would acknowledge itself not to be a measure of wealth. Instead, Seelig offers, quote, estimates, end quote, and, quote, projections, end quote, which cannot be based on, quote, precise, end quote, data regarding, quote, annual expenditures and income, end quote, and which ultimately are meant only to, quote, guide targeted advertising campaigns, end quote. These statements alone disqualify any real understanding of their subsequent reference to a, quote, growing economic power, end quote. Further, the report's own numbers show that black buying power accounts for only, quote, 8.7%, end quote, of the national whole, meaning far from any real power and relative even to a mythic buying power, that even the myth reflects a smaller proportion than the percent of the national population held by black people at roughly 14%. But again, just how do they arrive at their, quote, estimates and projections, end quote. In 1954, Secretary Weeks tied the assertion directly to the overall income of the black community. We've already seen how this is unsound, especially relative to an increased claim today of $1+ trillion when black people earn no more than $800 billion collectively. That is, the BLS counts as the national, quote, labor force, end quote, those over the age of 16 who are, quote, civilian, non-institutionalized, end quote, and who are not serving in the military. They estimate that there are roughly 20 million black members of the national labor force who they also estimate are earning, as of the third quarter of 2019, $727 per week. 727 by 52 weeks by 20 million workers is $740 billion annually. That is $460 billion less than the reported $1.2 trillion in buying power. Of course, this would also then require a popular redefinition of the term, quote, power, end quote, to mean spending more than every penny earned. Rowland and Tusi, 2018. Wealth, not income, is a far better determinant of economic condition. Income is acceptable if the goals are ad revenue and not assessment or analysis, which may explain why, even after close examination, the methods involved in arriving at the conclusions reached by the Seelig report are no clearer than before. Quoting at length from the report's, quote, methodology, end quote, because there are no direct measures of the buying power of African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, whites, and Hispanics, these estimates were calculated using national and regional economic models, univariate forecasting techniques, and data from various U.S. government sources. The model developed by the Seelig Center integrates statistical methods used in regional economics with those of market research. In general, the estimation process has two parts: estimating disposable personal income and allocating that estimate by race or ethnicity based on both population estimates and variances in per capita income. The Selig Center's estimates are consistent with the concepts and definitions used in the National Income and Product Accounts, NIPA. Readers should note that buying power is not the equivalent of aggregate money income as defined by the Census Bureau. Because the Selig Center's estimates are based on disposable personal income data obtained from the BEA, rather than money income values issued by the Census Bureau, the result is significantly higher estimates of buying power. There are several reasons for this lack of correspondence. First, the income definition used by the BEA is not the same as the definition used by the Census Bureau. Second, census income data are gathered through a nationwide survey sample of households, and respondents tend to underreport their income, which accounts for much of the discrepancy. Finally, the population universe for the census money income estimates differs from the universe used by the BEA. It should also be emphasized that the Selig Center's estimates are not equivalent to aggregate consumer expenditures as reported in the Consumer Expenditure Survey that is conducted each year by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Emphasis added. While the Selig report never demonstrates, defines, or shows their, quote, model developed, end quote, to assess buying power, what they do share, and especially the final claims themselves, do provide important keys to understanding the performance of the myth today. First, what is defined as, quote, disposable income, end quote, must be addressed, as it remains unclear and confuses often what is understood about Black income. That is, if, for example, it takes, quote, 44% of income to make rent in predominantly Black communities, end quote, Kurtz, 2017. And all told, the Black community earns roughly less than $800 billion annually. How then is there so much, quote, disposable, end quote, left for purchasing goods and services? Secondly, Selig acknowledges now, unlike the myth's 1954 origins, that, quote, buying power is not the equivalent of aggregate earned income as defined by the Census Bureau. Because the Selig Center's estimates are based on disposable personal income data obtained from the BEA, rather than money income values issued by the Census Bureau, the result is significantly higher estimates of buying power, end quote. They then also say that, quote, it should also be emphasized that the Selig Center's estimates are not equivalent to aggregate consumer expenditures as reported in the Consumer Expenditure Survey that is conducted each year by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, end quote. In other words, Selig, quote, estimates and projections, end quote, cannot be based on calculable numbers of actual incomes and actual expenditures. They must be generated by unclear methods to satisfy even more confused claims which never include public mention of the center's function to produce reports meant for targeting ad revenue and not explaining the actual conditions of any group. Further, Selig's use of data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, speaks to both flaws in its method and demonstrates a point of origin for the popularly disseminated and equally false idea that Black buying power should be equated to national economies and their gross domestic product, GDP. BEA studies are of national economies and GDP, which assists the confusion in heavy rotation that Black buying power is the equivalent of any number of top 25 national economies. However, these are not studies meant, again, to assess the actual conditions of various communities within those countries. GDP only measures the value of goods and services purchased in a given year, meaning GDP measures the wealth generated for those who own those goods and services and says nothing about the relative condition of those doing the spending. GDP does not measure inequality within any given national economy and therefore cannot measure the cavernous gaps between what black people earn and then spend on goods and services produced by white corporations. In fact, as shown in the Pew Research chart below, inequality actually can and does increase, as does GDP. When someone buys a sandwich, they have contributed to the national economy and GDP. But their relationship to the value created by that purchase is nothing compared to the owner of the sandwich shop or those who own the process of bringing food from farm to table or processing lab to grocery shelf. And it is this difference which is not measured by GDP. Further, as demos point out, it is again about distribution. Despite being a broad measure, there are several things that GDP does not measure that are essential for both the economy and society. Most glaringly, GDP does not capture the distribution of growth and, as a result, cannot reflect inequality. Since 1979, the bottom 20% of earners saw their income increase by 18%. Over the same time period, the top 20% of earners saw their income increase by 65%, and the top 1% saw their incomes increase by an astonishing 277%. The US GDP, meanwhile, more than doubled over the last 30 years, with no ability to reflect the growing income inequality. As the graph below shows, as GDP has increased, so has the level of inequality. Cha, 2013, emphasis added. While GDP offers up attractive numbers and provides speakers with an applause line and jaw dropping speech highlights, it is not known by economists as the preferred method for assessing inequality among specific groups within a given country. Buying power is a phrase developed by marketers to attract advertising revenue. The numbers read as immense and impressive, but in context, reveal themselves to be reflective only of what wealth is being generated for the owners of production. Large sums of buying power dollars do not reference or reflect the autonomous power of any group to use that money as they would choose, monolithically, and to the benefit of any whole. But when reports of and reporting about buying power are examined and juxtaposed with simultaneous but largely ignored economic analyses, what becomes most apparent is the process by which myth becomes reality. We can now look at the myth at play.